January 17, 1940, Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk coast. The wind cuts across the flat marshlands of the English coastline like a blade through canvas. Inside a brick tower rising from the Suffolk shore, a young operator named Margaret sits before a glowing cathode ray tube, her fingers resting lightly on the controls. The room hums with the electric warmth of valve amplifiers. Outside, the North Sea churns gray and endless. On her screen, a faint green phosphor blip pulses, then fades, then pulses again. She marks it on the plotting table with a wooden pointer. Distance, 40 miles. Bearing, east-southeast. Altitude, 12,000 feet. She does not yet know what this blip will become, but she knows it is there, suspended in the winter sky over water, invisible to the human eye, but utterly visible to the machine. The war is still new. The phony war, they call it. But already, in this room, a revolution is unfolding in silence. Across the Channel, in occupied France and the western airfields of the Reich, Luftwaffe bomber crews prepare for operations they believe are conducted in the cloak of surprise. They do not know about the towers. They do not know about the screens. They do not know that the sky itself has been wired with invisible tripwires, that the air has become a grid, and that every aircraft crossing the Channel is being watched long before it reaches the English coast. The Germans have radar too, primitive sets mounted on warships and experimental stations, but they do not yet grasp the scale, the sophistication, the network totality of what the British have built. They believe the advantage of speed and surprise remains theirs. They are wrong. This is not a story about a single battle or a lone raid. This is the story of an invisible net stretched across the sky, a technological and organizational masterpiece that rewrote the rules of air warfare before the first true blitz began. It is the story of how Britain transformed detection into defense, how secrecy became survival, and how German bomber crews, crossing the Channel with confidence in the cover of cloud and night, never realized they had been seen from the moment they left the ground. In the years before the war, while the world watched the rise of fascism with a mixture of apprehension and appeasement, a quiet cadre of British scientists was solving a problem that had haunted air defense since the invention of the airplane. How do you see something before it arrives? The question was not philosophical. It was tactical, urgent, and until 1935, unanswerable. Aircraft were fast. Warning times were short. By the time observers on the coast spotted enemy bombers, those bombers were minutes from their targets. Air raid sirens wailed, but there was no system to track formations as they crossed the sea, no way to vector defending fighters toward an invisible enemy, no way to prepare. Detection happened when it was already too late. Enter Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist with a restless mind and a talent for translating theory into hardware. In early 1935, he was asked by the Air Ministry to investigate whether a death ray, a science fiction fantasy of electromagnetic beams that could disable aircraft, might be feasible. Watson Watt quickly dismissed the death ray as impractical. But in the margins of his report, he sketched something else, a system that used radio waves not to destroy, but to detect. The principle was simple. Transmit a pulse of radio energy into the sky. If it strikes an object, a metal aircraft for instance, it reflects back. Measure the time delay between transmission and echo. Calculate distance. Track position. See the invisible. By February 1935, Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins conducted the first successful test near Daventry. A Hayford bomber flew through the beam of a BBC shortwave transmitter. On a cathode ray screen, a blip appeared. It was faint, flickering, but undeniable. The aircraft had been detected at a distance of 8 miles. The Air Ministry took notice. Funding followed. Within months, a prototype radar station was erected at Orfordness on the Suffolk coast. By 1937, a chain of stations, tall steel towers bristling with antennae, was under construction along Britain's eastern and southern shores. They called it Chain Home. The Germans knew none of this. German intelligence had noted the construction of tall masts along the English coast, but they misinterpreted them as radio communication towers or experimental broadcast stations. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights occasionally picked up strange radio emissions, but the signals were dismissed as interference or crude navigational beacons. The idea that the British had developed a coordinated radar network capable of detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles seemed implausible, even laughable. After all, German radar research was progressing too, but it remained fragmented, experimental, scattered across competing agencies and military branches. No one in Berlin imagined that the British had operationalized the technology on a national scale, integrating it into a command and control system that could track raids in real time and direct fighters accordingly. The assumption held firm: if we cannot see them with our eyes, they cannot see us. By the summer of 1939, the Chain Home network was operational. 20 stations stretched from the Orkney Islands to the Isle of Wight, each one capable of detecting aircraft formations at distances of up to 120 miles. The system was crude by later standards, prone to clutter, blind to low-flying aircraft, dependent on skilled operators interpreting ambiguous blips, but it worked. More importantly, it was networked. Data from the coastal stations fed into filter rooms and operations centers where plotters translated radar echoes into actionable intelligence. From there, sector controllers directed fighter squadrons toward incoming raids. For the first time in history, air defense was not reactive. It was anticipatory. The true genius of Chain Home was not the technology alone. It was the integration of technology, communication, and human coordination into a system. The radar provided the eyes. The telephone lines and radio networks provided the nerves. The filter rooms and operations centers provided the brain. Together, they formed what would later be recognized as the world's first integrated air defense system, a prototype of modern command and control born out of necessity and refined under the pressure of impending invasion. The German bomber crews who flew across the Channel in the spring and summer of 1940 were confident men. They had trained for years, honed their skills over Spain during the Civil War, and proven their worth in Poland and France. The Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force in the world, a precision instrument of blitzkrieg designed to shatter enemy defenses and support rapid armored advances. Their aircraft, Heinkel He-111s, Dornier Do-17s, Junkers Ju-88s, were modern, capable, and flown by crews who believed with some justification that they were the best in the world. When they crossed the Channel toward England, they expected scattered resistance, disorganized defenses, and skies empty of opposition until they neared their targets. The British, they had been told, were exhausted, their air force battered, their morale fragile. Victory was a matter of persistence. But from the moment a German bomber lifted off from an airfield in France or Belgium, it was being watched. Chain Home stations along the coast picked up the formation as it assembled over occupied territory. Operators marked the blips, estimated strength and altitude, passed the data to filter rooms. Within minutes, the information reached Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, where controllers updated situation maps and scrambled squadrons accordingly. By the time the German formation crossed the midpoint of the Channel, RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes were already climbing to intercept, guided by radio toward a target they could not yet see, but which had been tracked every mile of its journey. The German crews noticed the pattern quickly. British fighters appeared too often, too precisely, too early. It was uncanny. Raids that should have achieved complete surprise were met with organized resistance. Bombers found themselves engaged over the Channel, forced to jettison payloads early, harassed by fighters that seemed to know their altitude, heading, and speed before visual contact. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers struggled to explain it. Some theorized that British spies in France were radioing warnings. Others believed that the RAF had developed extraordinary observer networks, perhaps using fishing boats or coastal watchers with field telephones. A few suspected electronic detection, but the scale and accuracy required seemed beyond plausibility. The truth that every raid was being tracked from takeoff to landing by an invisible grid of radar stations remained hidden. One Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Marseille, later wrote in a letter home, "We do not fly over England with the freedom we enjoyed over Poland. The British know we are coming. Always they know. How? No one will say." His confusion was shared by hundreds of his comrades. The Spitfires did not appear by chance. They were not lucky, they were guided. But the mechanism remained a mystery, cloaked in the secrecy of signals intelligence and operational discipline. The British did not speak of radar in public. Captured German airmen were interrogated, but carefully, so as not to reveal the source of interception accuracy. The secret held. The psychological effect on German crews was subtle but corrosive. Confidence began to erode. The sense of surprise, of striking from the unknown, evaporated. Every mission over England became a calculated risk, every crossing of the Channel a moment of vulnerability. The bomber crews began to rely more heavily on fighter escorts, but even the Messerschmitt Bf 100Is could not remain over England for long. Their fuel range was limited, and the return journey left bombers exposed. Losses mounted, efficiency declined. The Luftwaffe, designed for short, sharp campaigns of tactical support, found itself grinding against an enemy that could see it coming and respond with coordinated precision. The technology behind Chain Home was, by modern standards, primitive. The transmitters were massive, low-frequency systems operating in the HF band, around 20 to 30 megahertz. The aerials were fixed, mounted on steel towers up to 350 feet tall, and could not rotate. Range estimation was accurate, but bearing resolution was crude. The system could not detect low-flying aircraft. Anything below 500 feet slipped under the radar horizon, a vulnerability the Germans would later exploit. But in the crucial early years of the war, when Luftwaffe raids flew at medium and high altitudes, Chain Home was devastatingly effective. Operators sat in darkened rooms, watching oscilloscope screens where blips crawled across glowing green grids. The signals were noisy, filled with clutter from ground reflections, weather, and interference. Distinguishing a real contact from a false echo required skill, intuition, and experience. Many operators were women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, trained in the subtleties of radar interpretation. Their work was tedious, repetitive, and absolutely critical. A missed blip could mean an undetected raid. A false alarm could exhaust fighter squadrons and waste fuel. The operators learned to read the screens like musicians read sheet music, detecting patterns in chaos, discerning intention in ambiguity. Behind the operators, the filter rooms processed the raw data. Plotters, also predominantly women, moved markers across large maps, translating radar contacts into tracks. Each track was assigned a designation, an estimated strength, a probable heading. The information was passed to sector controllers who made the tactical decisions, which squadrons to scramble, which altitude to climb to, which sector to patrol. The entire system ran on telephone lines, radio links, and human discipline. There were no computers, no automated data processing. Everything depended on speed, accuracy, and trust in the chain of information. The Germans, when they finally began to suspect the existence of radar, attempted to jam or deceive the system. Luftwaffe units dropped bundles of metal foil, Dupel, later known as chaff, to create false echoes and confuse operators. But Chain Home operators learned to distinguish chaff clouds from solid contacts. The German bombers still appeared on the screens, identifiable by their steady movement and consistent altitude. Jamming efforts were launched, but the British quickly adapted, switching frequencies or filtering out interference. The electronic war between detection and deception had begun, but in the critical years of 1940 and 1941, the advantage remained firmly with the defenders. It is worth noting that Chain-Home was not the only radar system in British service. By 1940, supplementary systems like Chain-Home Low were being deployed to cover the altitude gaps. Airborne radars were being fitted to night fighters, allowing them to detect enemy bombers in the dark. Ground-controlled interception stations guided these night fighters with increasing accuracy. The entire air defense network was evolving, learning, adapting. The Germans were engaged in a technological and tactical arms race they did not fully understand, against an opponent whose capabilities they persistently underestimated. The symbolic object in this story is not a weapon or a ration, but the glowing cathode ray tube, the screen that transformed invisible radio echoes into visible tracks, the interface between physics and perception. In every Chain-Home station, in every filter room, that green phosphor glow was the focal point of attention, the surface where information became knowledge and knowledge became action. The screens hummed with life, flickering with the presence of unseen aircraft, translating electromagnetic reflections into tactical reality. They were the eyes of a nation, the technological extension of vigilance, the silent watchers that never blinked. For the operators, the screen was both mundane and sacred. Hours of monotony, empty skies, quiet shifts, the slow rotation of the sweep line, punctuated by moments of intense focus when blips appeared and decisions cascaded. The screen showed nothing but abstract geometry, range rings, bearing lines, phosphor dots. But in those abstractions, lives hung in balance. Each blip represented dozens of men in metal machines, crossing hostile skies with lethal intent. Each correct plot could mean a successful interception, a bomber turned back, a city spared. Each error could mean death. The Germans never saw these screens. They never sat in the darkened rooms where their approach was marked, their altitude estimated, their fate decided. They flew through skies they thought were empty of observation, never imagining that their every movement was being recorded, analyzed, and countered. The screens were Britain's secret, the invisible advantage that transformed desperation into defense. And because the secret held, the Luftwaffe continued to fly into a net they could not see, never understanding why the RAF was always ready, always waiting, always there. The effectiveness of Chain-Home reached its zenith during the Battle of Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940. Day after day, German bomber formations crossed the Channel, targeting airfields, radar stations, ports, and eventually cities. Day after day, RAF fighters rose to meet them, guided by the radar network that tracked every raid. The numbers tell the story. In July, the Luftwaffe launched over 1,800 sorties against Britain. By September, despite increasing efforts, the German losses were unsustainable. Fighter Command, outnumbered and stretched thin, held because it did not waste its strength on patrols over empty skies. It struck where the enemy was, when intelligence, provided by radar, confirmed the threat. German commanders grew frustrated. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, berated his pilots for failing to achieve air superiority. He could not understand why British fighters appeared so quickly, so frequently, so precisely. His intelligence officers reported that RAF Fighter Command should have been destroyed weeks ago, that British airfields should be smoldering ruins, that resistance should have collapsed. Yet the fighters kept coming. Göring blamed his pilots, questioned their courage, demanded greater effort. He did not grasp that the problem was not bravery or tactics, but information. The British knew, they saw, and knowledge was power. In August 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted strategy, targeting the radar stations themselves. Chain home towers at Ventnor, Dover, Rye, and Pevensey were bombed. Some stations were damaged, knocked offline for hours or days. But the network was resilient. Redundant stations covered gaps. Mobile units were deployed. Repairs were swift. And even when individual stations fell silent, the system as a whole continued to function. The Germans did not press the attacks on radar stations long enough to cripple the network. Instead, they shifted focus again, this time to London, beginning the Blitz. It was a strategic error born of frustration and impatience, and it gave Fighter Command the breathing room it needed to recover and rebuild. The pilots of Fighter Command, British, Polish, Czech, Canadian, and volunteers from across the free world, knew they were being guided. They heard the calm voices of controllers over the radio, directing them to vector headings, climb altitudes, interception points. They trusted the system, even when it meant flying blind into cloud or climbing toward an enemy they could not yet see. The invisible hand of radar guided them, and they learned to trust it. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, a Hurricane pilot, later wrote, "We did not know how they knew, but we knew they knew. We followed the vectors, and the enemy was always there, waiting to be met." By late 1940, German intelligence finally began to piece together the truth. Captured RAF personnel mentioned radar. Interrogations revealed references to RDF, radio direction finding, the British cover name. Luftwaffe technical officers analyzed wreckage of British night fighters and found rudimentary airborne radar sets. Slowly, reluctantly, the Germans accepted that the British possessed a sophisticated detection network, but acceptance came too late. The Battle of Britain had been lost. The invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. The Luftwaffe would continue to bomb British cities throughout the war, but the prospect of achieving air superiority, the prerequisite for invasion, had slipped away, in part because of the invisible net that tracked every raid before it crossed the coast. The irony is that Germany had radar too. The Freya and Würzburg systems, developed in parallel with Chain Home, were in some respects more advanced, higher frequency, better resolution, more compact. But German radar was deployed piecemeal, controlled by competing military branches, never integrated into a unified defense system. The Luftwaffe used radar for tactical purposes, guiding night fighters, directing flak batteries, but never achieved the strategic coordination that the British had built into Chain Home. The organizational innovation, the integration of detection and command, the discipline of centralized control, these were the decisive advantages, and they could not be replicated quickly. American observers watching the Battle of Britain from the sidelines took note. Delegations visited Fighter Command headquarters, toured radar stations, studied the integration of technology and tactics. The lessons learned influenced the development of American air defense systems in the Pacific and Europe. By the time the United States entered the war, radar had become a standard component of military operations, but the British had pioneered its use on a strategic scale. Chain Home was the prototype, the proof of concept, the operational validation of a technology that would shape air warfare for decades to come. The experience of German bomber crews over England stands in stark contrast to their earlier victories. Over Poland, over France, over the Low Countries, they had flown with impunity, striking targets with precision, supporting ground forces, demonstrating the doctrine of blitzkrieg. They expected England to be more of the same, a short, sharp campaign, a demonstration of overwhelming force, a prelude to negotiated peace or total victory. Instead, they found an enemy that could see them, that met them in the air, that made every mission a grinding attrition. The surprise was not tactical, it was existential. The rules of engagement had changed, and they had not been informed. Some German pilots began to speak of the invisible watchers, a superstitious acknowledgement that the British seemed to possess an uncanny awareness. Letters home hinted at frustration, confusion, a sense that the enemy had an advantage they could not match. One Luftwaffe observer, writing in his diary after a particularly costly raid, noted, "We are not fighting men alone. We are fighting machines that think, that see without eyes, that know without witnesses. How do you defeat an enemy who sees you before you see him?" The answer, of course, was that you did not. Not in 1940, not with the technology and tactics available. The Luftwaffe adapted, switching to night raids to evade radar-guided day fighters, developing Pathfinder techniques, employing electronic countermeasures, but the fundamental disadvantage remained. The British could see them, the British were ready, and the bombers kept falling. As the war progressed, radar evolved. Centimetric radar, operating at much higher frequencies, provided finer resolution and allowed detection of smaller objects, including surfaced submarines. Airborne early warning radar extended detection ranges over the ocean. The cavity magnetron, developed in Britain and shared with the United States under the Tizard mission, revolutionized radar technology and became one of the most significant technical exchanges of the war. By 1943, radar had become ubiquitous, on ships, on aircraft, on ground installations, integrated into fire control systems, navigation aids, and targeting computers. But Chain-Home, the crude, lumbering system of fixed towers and oscilloscope screens, remained operational throughout the war. It was supplemented, improved, eventually superseded by more advanced systems, but it was never entirely retired. The operators who watched the screens, the plotters who moved the markers, the controllers who guided the fighters, they continued their work, night after night, shift after shift, the invisible sentinels of the home front. Their contribution was unglamorous, repetitive, and absolutely essential. Without them, the Battle of Britain might have had a different outcome. Without them, the invasion of England might have been feasible. Without them, the war might have taken a darker turn. The lasting impact of Chain-Home extends beyond the Battle of Britain. It established principles that define modern air defense: integrated detection, centralized command, networked communication, real-time data processing. It demonstrated that technology alone is insufficient. Organization, training, and human judgment are equally critical. It proved that secrecy is a force multiplier, that an advantage unknown to the enemy is an advantage doubled. And it showed that even a technologically inferior system, intelligently deployed and skillfully operated, can overcome a more powerful adversary. The Germans never fully grasped how comprehensively they had been outmaneuvered until after the war, when Allied intelligence released details of the radar network and its role in the defense of Britain. Captured Luftwaffe officers expressed astonishment at the scale and sophistication of the system. Some admitted that, had they known, tactics would have been different, priorities shifted, perhaps the entire air campaign reconsidered. But ignorance had been their enemy as much as the RAF. They flew into a sky they thought was empty of observers, and they paid the price for their blindness. There is a moment recorded in the operations log of RAF Fighter Command on September 15, 1940, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, when the radar network detected the largest German raid of the campaign. Over 200 bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, assembled over France and began their approach toward London. Chain-Home stations tracked the formation from the moment it took shape. Plotters marked the tracks on the situation map at Bentley Priory. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, watching the board fill with enemy markers, committed every available squadron to the defense. The result was a massive air battle over southern England, with RAF fighters meeting the Germans in waves, attacking again and again, breaking up formations, forcing bombers to jettison their payloads early. The Germans lost 56 aircraft that day. The RAF lost 29. The raid was a failure, the Luftwaffe's largest single-day loss of the campaign. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion was off. Britain would not fall. And in the filter rooms and radar stations, operators and plotters returned to their shifts, marking blips, moving pointers, watching screens. They did not celebrate. They did not know in that moment that the tide had turned. They simply continued their work as they had done every day before, as they would do every day after, until the war was won. The cathode ray screens that illuminated chain home stations were more than instruments. They were symbols of a kind of vigilance that transcended human limitations, extending perception beyond the horizon, beyond the weather, beyond the night. They represented the marriage of science and strategy, the application of abstract physics to the concrete problem of survival. And they embodied a peculiarly British response to existential threat. Not panic, not despair, but methodical preparation, technological innovation, and quiet determination. When German bomber crews crossed the Channel, they carried with them the confidence of conquerors, the expectation of surprise, the belief that their skill and courage would prevail. They never knew that their every move was being watched by machines and minds working in concert, that the sky they flew through had been transformed into a battlefield where information was the decisive weapon. They never saw the green glow of the screens that marked their approach, the calm movements of the plotters who tracked their progress, the controlled urgency of the controllers who vectored fighters toward them. They flew into a net they could not see, and they did not understand why they kept losing until it was too late. The invisible watchers saw them. The invisible watchers knew. And knowledge, married to action, became the shield that saved a nation. In the decades after the war, radar became so commonplace, so ubiquitous, that its revolutionary nature was forgotten. Air traffic control, weather forecasting, navigation, defense, all depend on technologies descended from those crude chain-home towers. The cathode ray tube gave way to digital displays, oscilloscopes to computer monitors, fixed antenna to phased arrays and synthetic aperture systems. But the principle remains. Send a signal, receive an echo, interpret the return, see the invisible, know the unknown. The operators who sat before the screens in 1940, watching blips crawl across glowing grids, are mostly gone now. Their work was classified for years, their contribution unrecognized except in official histories and veterans' memoirs. But without them, without the system they operated, without the invisible net they maintained, the Battle of Britain might have ended differently. The Luftwaffe might have achieved air superiority. Operation Sea Lion might have been launched. The course of the war, the fate of Europe, the shape of the world, all might have changed. They did not fire guns. They did not fly fighters. They watched screens. They plotted tracks. They passed information. And in doing so, they helped turn the tide of history. The final irony is that the Germans, despite their technological prowess, despite their scientific achievements, despite their formidable war machine, were undone in part by a failure of imagination. They could not imagine that the British had developed and deployed a system of such scale and sophistication. They could not imagine that every raid was being tracked from the moment of takeoff. They could not imagine that the empty sky was in fact a grid, wired with invisible lines of sight, watched by tireless observers who never slept and never blinked. And because they could not imagine it, they did not adapt quickly enough. They did not prioritize attacks on the radar stations. They did not develop effective countermeasures. They did not integrate their own radar systems into a unified defensive network. They flew with confidence into a sky that saw them, and they paid the price. This is the larger truth that Chain Home embodies, that wars are won not only by courage or firepower, but by knowledge and organization. That technology without integration is merely hardware. That secrecy, discipline, and coordination are force, multipliers as potent as any weapon. That the ability to see the enemy before the enemy sees you is worth more than 100 squadrons of fighters. The German bomber crews who crossed the Channel never knew they were visible. They flew through clouds and darkness, believing themselves hidden, believing the advantage was theirs. But the screens glowed green in the darkened rooms, the plotters moved their markers, the controllers issued vectors, and the fighters climbed to meet them. The invisible net held. The watchers watched. And the outcome of the war turned, in part, on the simple fact that one side could see and the other could not. In the end, freedom was defended not only by the brave pilots who flew into the sun, but by the quiet vigilance of those who watched the screens, who saw the invisible, who turned electromagnetic echoes into actionable intelligence, who built a system that transformed the sky itself into a weapon of defense. The Germans never knew, and because they never knew, they lost.